I'm Ann Fishman with Richard Jonas of EHR TV. We are with Randy Schiff, Vice President of Aprima Medical Software. Randy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
We would like to talk about the very important topic of meaningful use. Would you speak to the final rules that just came out this summer?
So the interim final rules were published earlier in the year, and there's an open comment period of 60 days where anybody could make suggestions on their perspectives of what the final rule ought to be. The government received over 2,000 comments during that period of time, and then they went through those, and in July, the middle of July, they published the final rule. The interesting thing that came out is that while the criteria that were published in the interim final rule remained the same, some of the requirements were changed. They were lessened. For example, originally some of the physicians were going to have to submit, I think, 70% of their prescriptions electronically, and in the final rule that number was reduced. There were some exceptions that were made for specialties that don't do prescriptions at all, for example. The other thing that was changed in the final rule was that the criteria, there was a list of 25, and I'm speaking only for ambulatory EHR. I'm not speaking at all about hospital EHR software. But for ambulatory EHR software, they broke the criteria into two sets, a set of core items and a menu set items. So in that group of 25, there were 15 core items, and everybody has to do those, all 15 of those. And then in the menu set, there were 10 items there, and a physician can choose 5 out of 10. They have to report 5 out of 10 of those. So again, from the interim final rule stage, the physician would have had to have done all 25. After the comment period and the final rule, they only have to do the 15 core and then 5 of the 10 in the menu set.
One of the components of meaningful use is to be using a certified EHR. So would you speak to the certification process in general?
Sure. So I think one of the things to keep in mind is what the government originally did and where we ended up now. Originally, the government said there were going to be businesses or organizations that would be a testing body, and then there would be another organization that would be a certification body. So an EHR vendor like Aprima, we would take our software to the first vendor, it would be tested against the standards, and then the standards, the results of the test would be passed to another organization which would certify those results, and then we as a vendor would get the result of that certification. The government realized they were very interested in being able to have vendors certified by October, and they realized that for companies to apply to become a testing body and a certification body, it was going to be very difficult for EHR vendors to ultimately get certified by October so that there would be certified products in the market by January of 2011, which is really what they were trying to achieve. So the government said, you know, we're going to have a temporary process where a single organization can be both a testing organization and a certifying body. And so anybody could apply to do that, and if they met the government criteria, then they were announced as an ATCB, an Authorized Testing and Certification Body. To date, there are 3 organizations that have achieved that. The first one was CCHIT, which is the Certification Commission on Healthcare Information Technology, a long-term player in the industry from an EHR vendor standpoint for assessing the quality of EHR products. The second one was the Drummond Group, and then the third one is a company called InfoGuard. So today, an EHR vendor can take their software to any of those 3 organizations and have their software tested and certified to hopefully ultimately become a certified product. The interesting thing is that all 3 of those organizations, remember, they had to apply to the government, and in order for them to be chosen by the government, they had to prove that they could follow the government's procedures exactly so that any vendor's product that ultimately receives certification would be exactly the same as any other, would have gone through exactly the same process as any other vendor. And the standards that the government used for the certification were established by NIST, the National Institutes of Standard and Technology. So all 3 of those groups, CCHIT, Drummond, and InfoGuard, would have taken the NIST standards and run a product like Aprima software through that, ultimately to get the certification.
How onerous do you think the meaningful use standards are for physicians to comply with?
So Perhaps in a couple of specialty situations, there may be some challenges, but for the most part, I would say it's not difficult. The software today does, so much of what the physician would need to have done on paper in the past. Kind of an interesting analogy is that if you're familiar with PQRI, the Physician Quality Reporting Initiative, there was a 2% or so kicker that was available to physicians. And if you weren't on an electronic health record software, it really wasn't worth the extra paperwork it would have taken to qualify for that. But if you were on electronic health record software that allowed you to do that, then it just kind of came out of your workflow. In Aprima, for example, when a physician is documenting a patient's visit, they can see when they've done the things that are required for PQRI. It just shows up on the screen. They don't have to do anything differently, and then they submit that and they receive the certification. But with a certified EHR, as far as meaningful use, then the software is really going to step them through everything that they need to do, and the vendors are going to let them know which of the menu set. There was the core set of 15 items and the menu set of 5 out of the 10. The vendors are going to recommend which of the 5 are going to be the ones that they ought to be able to do. But I don't think, for the most part, I don't think it's going to add very much of a burden at all.
So as a vendor in the certification process, I assume you have to pass all 25 criteria. The 15 mandatory, the 10, the physician picks 5, but as a vendor, again, correct me where I'm wrong, you have to pass all 25 to meet the meaningful use.
Right, and
as a vendor.
Yeah, so as a vendor, our software had to pass all 25 of those. And the reason is that in that menu set, where the physician can choose 5 out of 10, some specialties, some of those menu set items may not apply. And so, of course, we would want to be able to sell our software to anybody, and so it needed to handle all 25 of the criteria. You actually bring up another good point too, and there's 2 ways that an EHR product could be certified in this process. One is as a complete EHR, and one is as a modular EHR. Aprima was certified as a complete EHR, which means the physician can buy Aprima, and any of those 25 criteria they'll be able to satisfy. There are other products that may not have that breadth, but they could be certified as a modular EHR, and then the physician could kind of cobble together, perhaps with the recommendation of that EHR vendor, the physician could cobble together all of the components so that ultimately they would have a complete EHR. Okay. But there were 2 levels of certification.
We're in phase 1 of the paradigm. When phase 2 kicks in, what new requirements will likely be in place?
And let's couple that with the second question, not only what paradigms, but do you think these paradigms are being driven? Is technology driving what ONC is looking at, or are physicians driving it? Because there's a clear differentiator between what a physician needs to practice versus a set of requirements that says you have to do 1, 2, and 3. And how do those meld together?
Right, so the way I look at it, there were the 3 stages. So stage 1, which was announced earlier this summer, and that's what will go into place in January of 2011. The stage 2 criteria are forecasted to be ready by 2013, and then the stage 3 criteria by 2015. So one of the things that we know is that as you go from stage 1 to 2 to 3, the criteria that are in there are going to be increasingly onerous. So the key takeaway there is that it's better to start now. And when you start to look at what the reimbursement models are, the government has really front-loaded the whole process. So there's more money available in the first few years. If you don't start until several years out, there's potentially less money that's available for you. And the stages that you have to attest to are easier the sooner that you start. So a vendor that, or a physician that starts now, in January of 2011, they can meet the stage 1 requirements, which can be the easiest of the 3 stages, twice. They meet the stage 2 requirements twice, and then they only have to meet the stage 3 requirements once. If you delay for just a year and don't start to use the software in until 2012, you meet the stage 1 requirements once. The stage 2, I think, is twice, and then the stage 3 is twice, if I have that right. So one of the things then is start now. As far as the components and the criteria, the second stage, as we talked about the first stage, having the 15 core items and the 10 menu set items, and the physician can choose from that menu set. Everything that we've read that we believe is that in stage 2, all 25 of those will be core requirements. Okay, so that's an example of one of the differences between stage 1 and stage 2. Stage 1 was really about enabling the physician to be able to gather the data and to provide some educational materials for the patient to make transactions easier. The second stage and the third stage ultimately are designed to enable higher quality of care for the patients and to make that care more readily available across the nation, and then also to increase the reporting of disease states and disease outbreaks, so that the government can kind of better track those things. So the second and third stages are going to go deeper into what the care, what the delivery of care is all about.
So what's Aprima's position then, perhaps, and maybe position is the wrong word, but the movement towards a personal health record and both the security of that data? You mentioned just now about a patient's moving or health record being available, so the patient's health record should play a large piece. Do you see that as a major focal point in the future for making sure that patients are educated?
Well, the education piece is actually part of the meaningful use requirement. So, for example, a physician is expected to be able to hand a patient their continuum of care record, or documents that talk about smoking cessation or diabetes management or what have you. As far as the personal health record, though, it's not an area that Aprima plays in today. There are certainly very large organizations and very large insurance companies that have taken a position there, but it's not an area that Aprima's involved in.
Well, it has been a very interesting interview. We thank you so much. Randy Schiff.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So much. Randy Schiff.
Thank you.